Act 1. The Castle in Transylvania. Jonathan Harker was not a man easily unsettled. At 25, he carried himself with the confidence of a young solicitor beginning to make his way in the world. He had a sharp mind, a steady manner, and every reason to be optimistic about his future. His firm had entrusted him with an important case, to travel to Transylvania and assist a nobleman named Count Dracula with the purchase of estates in England. It was a long journey, but Jonathan welcomed the adventure. He had never been so far from home, and he looked forward to writing every detail to his beloved fiancée, Mina Murray. The journey began pleasantly enough, with trains rattling through the heart of Europe. But the further east he traveled, the more unfamiliar the land became. The languages changed, the clothing of the people grew more rustic, and the mountains rose higher each day until the jagged Carpathians loomed like a wall at the edge of the world. At each station and inn, when Jonathan mentioned the name of his destination, people grew uneasy. Faces darkened, conversations ended abruptly. Old women pressed charms into his hands, garlic, small crucifixes, herbs tied with twine. Some muttered prayers, in languages he did not understand. One woman clutched his arm with such desperation that her nails dug into his skin, pleading with him not to go further, not to keep his appointment with the Count. Jonathan tried to laugh it off. He was English, a man of law, raised in the rational traditions of his country. Ghost stories and peasant superstitions were not for him. And yet, as his carriage climbed higher into the mist-draped passes, he could not entirely shake the unease. The landscape was wild, beautiful, and desolate. Pines crowded the road, their branches casting long shadows across the rocky path. The air grew thinner, colder, and wolves could be heard howling from somewhere deep in the forest. Their cries carried through the night like mournful horns, and Jonathan's driver crossed himself each time the sound rose. At last the carriage stopped at a lonely inn where Jonathan was to await the Count's own transport. The innkeeper and his wife begged him not to go, urging him to stay the night and turn back in the morning. They spoke in broken German, mixing with their native tongue, but their meaning was clear. When he insisted, they pressed into his hands a rosary, hanging heavy with silver beads, and kissed his hand, as though saying farewell to a condemned man. Jonathan was not one to mock the kindness of strangers. He tucked the rosary into his pocket, though he told himself it was only to honor their hospitality. As the sun sank, a strange carriage arrived. It was black as pitch, drawn by powerful horses whose eyes gleamed red in the torchlight. The driver was a tall figure, wrapped in a heavy cloak, his face hidden in shadow. His grip, when he helped Jonathan into the carriage, was like iron. Not a word was spoken. With a crack of the whip, they raced into the night. The ride was harrowing. The horses charged through twisting mountain paths at reckless speed, the wheels of the carriage skidding dangerously near the cliffs. Shadows leapt in the flickering torchlight, and each time the wolves howled, the horses reared and fought against their harnesses. Yet the driver controlled them with superhuman strength, his grip unyielding, his silence unbroken. Jonathan clung to the seat, his heart hammering. Never in his life had he felt so helpless, carried like prey into the jaws of the wilderness. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. It was impossible to tell in the blackness. Finally, the carriage halted before a towering fortress. High walls loomed above, their stones scarred by centuries of wind and storm. The moon revealed narrow windows like watchful eyes, and a great wooden door, ancient and scarred, that groaned as it opened. There stood Count Dracula. He was taller than Jonathan expected, with a thin, pallid face and a nose as sharp as his long white teeth. His eyes gleamed in the torchlight, dark and piercing, and his handshake, though firm, was colder than any hand Jonathan had ever held. His manner was gracious, his words smooth, his accent thick but clear. He welcomed Jonathan into his home with the politeness of an aristocrat, though there was something in his presence, something Jonathan could not name, that stirred both fascination and dread. Inside, the castle was vast and echoing. Corridors stretched into darkness, staircases coiled upward into shadow. There were no servants. Only the Count moved about, lighting lamps and carrying Jonathan's bags with surprising strength. His hospitality seemed genuine, yet uncanny. The food was laid out for Jonathan alone. The Count never ate nor drank. In the days that followed, Jonathan tried to lose himself in business. He examined deeds, discussed property, and made careful notes for his firm. Dracula showed a keen interest in London, particularly in houses near busy streets and institutions. He asked Jonathan endless questions about English customs, government, and even slang. At times, his eagerness seemed almost childlike, but there was a calculating edge beneath the curiosity, as if every detail were a weapon he intended to wield. Yet as the days turned into nights, always nights, Jonathan began to sense the truth. He was never permitted outside except in the courtyard. Many doors in the castle were locked. Windows were barred. He was a guest, yes, but also a prisoner. The Count vanished during the day, his rooms empty and silent, and Jonathan began to hear strange movements at night, the creak of doors, the scrape of footsteps, the flutter of wings. One evening, while shaving, Jonathan accidentally cut himself. It was only a nick. But when Dracula saw the blood, his eyes blazed with hunger. He lunged forward, lips parted, before suddenly recoiling at the sight of the rosary that Jonathan still wore around his neck. With a snarl, the Count hurled the mirror from the wall, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. Jonathan stood frozen, horrified, as Dracula vanished into the corridor without another word. His fear grew with every passing night. He witnessed Dracula crawling down the sheer walls of the castle like a lizard, clinging with inhuman ease, slipping into the darkness below. He began to understand that his host was not a man, but something far older, something monstrous. The name vampire rose unbidden in his mind. And then came the night he discovered the women. Jonathan, wandering in search of escape, entered a chamber heavy with dust and the scent of decay. There, 3 women emerged from the shadows. They were beautiful, their faces pale and glowing, their lips red as blood. Their laughter was low and musical, their movements graceful as serpents. They circled him, whispering promises of sweetness, of kisses that would never end. Jonathan's heart pounded with both terror and an unholy desire. One bent close, her breath cool upon his neck, her lips brushing his skin. A roar filled the chamber. Dracula himself appeared, his eyes blazing with fury. He seized the woman by the throat and hurled her across the room. With a voice that shook the very stones, he declared, "This man belongs to me." Jonathan, trembling, could not move. His blood ran cold at the Count's words. He was not a guest. He was property. From that night forward, Jonathan knew he was living on borrowed time. He wrote feverishly in his journal, describing all he had seen, should anyone ever find it. He dreamed of Mina's face and clung to the thought of her as his only anchor. At last, he resolved to escape. When dawn came, he climbed out upon the castle walls, the abyss yawning beneath him, the cries of wolves echoing through the mountains. His hands bled from the stone, his body shook with terror, but his will was stronger. Better to fall into the jaws of the wilderness than remain in the grip of the Count. Jonathan's final words in his journal were desperate, almost frantic. "If I perish, let it be known that I have seen the devil himself, and he walks under the name of Dracula." Act 2. Dracula arrives in England. While Jonathan Harker struggled in the shadow of the Carpathians, events were already stirring far away. The Count had prepared carefully for his departure. In the cellars of the castle, coffins were filled with earth from his homeland, soil that carried the dark essence of his power. These were packed and sealed, ready for transport. For the vampire could not live long without the earth of his native grave. And so, when Jonathan's fate hung in the balance, the Count's plans moved forward. A wagon creaked away from the castle, carrying boxes heavy with earth, down the twisting mountain roads to the nearest port. From there, a ship was chartered, the Demeter, bound for England. The sailors who loaded the strange cargo wondered at its weight, but they asked no questions. Work was work, and the voyage promised good pay. The Demeter set sail under clear skies. Her captain, a weathered man of many voyages, wrote faithfully in his log. At first, all seemed ordinary, but before long, unease spread among the crew. Men reported hearing strange noises in the hold at night, the scrape of wood, the sound of shifting boxes. Some swore they saw a tall figure moving in the shadows, though no passenger had boarded. One by one, the sailors disappeared. First a cabin boy, then a deckhand, then another. Panic spread. The crew whispered that a monster had come aboard with the cargo. The captain tried to keep order, but his entries in the log grew darker each day. Crew shrinking. No trace of the men. God help us. Storms battered the ship as if the very sea rebelled against its cargo. The winds howled, the sails tore, and the Demeter drifted like a ghost across the waves. At last, only the captain remained, lashed to the wheel, his crucifix clutched in stiff fingers. His final act was to keep the vessel steady as it crashed into the harbor of Whitby on the English coast. When townsfolk found the wreck, they discovered only the dead captain, tied to his post, eyes wide in eternal vigil. The ship's log told the tale of terror at sea, but the cargo was unbroken, 50 boxes of earth delivered safely to their destination. And of the figure said to have leapt ashore like a great black dog, nothing was seen. Dracula had arrived. In Whitby, the quiet seaside town, life continued unknowing. Mina Murray, the devoted fiancée of Jonathan Harker, was visiting her friend, Lucy Westenra. Mina was practical, intelligent, and loyal. She kept her mind occupied by writing in her journal, recording her thoughts with clarity and discipline. It was her way of keeping close to Jonathan, from whom she had not heard in weeks. Lucy was the opposite in many ways. Fair-haired, charming, and full of life, she was adored by all who knew her. She had 3 suitors, each deeply in love: Dr. John Seward, who managed a nearby asylum; Arthur Holmwood, a nobleman of good family; and Quincy Morris, a spirited American adventurer. Though she could only choose one, she valued them all, and their devotion never wavered. It was during one of their summer evenings in Whitby that Mina and Lucy noticed something strange. High upon the cliffs above the harbor, a dark figure stood against the moonlight, motionless, watching. When they looked again, he was gone. The memory lingered, but they thought little of it then. Soon after, Lucy began to walk in her sleep. Mina often found her wandering to the abbey ruins on the cliffside, pale and shivering in the night air. She thought it little more than a nervous habit, until one evening she saw a tall figure bending over Lucy in the moonlight. By the time she reached her friend, the figure had vanished into the shadows, leaving Lucy weak and trembling. The days that followed brought no improvement. Lucy grew pale, her once bright eyes dulled with exhaustion. 2 small marks appeared upon her throat, which she explained away as insect bites, though Mina suspected otherwise. She cared for her friend tirelessly, yet could not prevent the decline. Lucy's suitors grew anxious, and Dr. Seward, baffled by the case, summoned his old mentor, Professor Abraham Van Helsing, a man of science, but also of deeper knowledge. And so, while Mina tended Lucy with all the devotion of a sister, and while Whitby remained blissfully unaware of the shadow that had crept into its midst, the Count began his work. Each night he came, feeding upon Lucy's blood, draining her strength while growing in his own. England had welcomed its uninvited guest, though it knew it not. Act 3. Lucy's decline. Lucy Westenra had always been the light in every room she entered. Her laughter lifted spirits, her beauty seemed almost unearthly, and her heart was as generous as her smile. But as the days in Whitby turned to nights filled with shadows, that brightness began to fade. Mina, ever attentive, noticed first. Lucy was restless, pale, and weaker with each morning. Her sleepwalking grew worse, and Mina often found her at the abbey ruins, standing in her nightdress under the moon, as though in a trance. At times Mina thought she saw a shadow retreating as she approached, tall and dark, slipping into the night like a beast. When Dr. Seward examined Lucy, he was troubled. Her pulse was weak, her complexion ashen. And then there were the marks upon her throat, faint but distinct, as if 2 tiny wounds had not healed. He puzzled over them, unable to explain. No ordinary illness accounted for such loss of blood, such exhaustion without fever. It was then he summoned his mentor, Professor Abraham Van Helsing. Van Helsing was a man of deep learning, respected in medicine, philosophy, and even obscure lore. He arrived with calm authority, and at once he took Lucy's case seriously. His examinations were methodical, his questions sharp, but behind his eyes lay a weight of knowledge he did not yet reveal. When Seward suggested causes, anemia, infection, Van Helsing shook his head slowly. "We must act quickly," he said gravely. Lucy's condition worsened with frightening speed. Her lips, once red, grew pale. Her eyes sank. At times she could barely lift her head from the pillow. Yet when Arthur Holmwood, her chosen fiancé, entered the room, her smile flickered with warmth, as though love alone could delay the darkness closing in. Van Helsing prescribed what he could, but most urgently, he demanded blood. Lucy needed transfusions to restore what she had lost. In those days, the procedure was still new, still dangerous, but there was no hesitation among her suitors. Arthur, Seward, even the gallant Quincy Morris, offered themselves without thought. Again and again, each gave of their strength, watching the color briefly return to Lucy's cheeks. But by the next night, the pallor returned. Each dawn found her weaker than the day before. Van Helsing kept vigil, his eyes never leaving her. He placed garlic blossoms around her room, hung crucifixes above her bed, and forbade the windows be opened. Yet each time Mina or the others looked away, something or someone found its way inside. Mina, torn between caring for her friend and her worry for Jonathan, left for Budapest when word came that he had been found alive, fevered and weak, but still breathing. She married him there in quiet haste, her heart full of relief. Yet in leaving, she was not there to witness the final days of Lucy Westenra. Lucy's decline became unstoppable. There were moments of clarity, when her voice was soft and pleading, when she reached for Arthur and begged him not to grieve. And there were other moments, darker, when her voice changed, low and mocking, when her eyes gleamed with unnatural fire. In those moments, Van Helsing grew stern, insisting all holy protections remain close. At last, one night, Lucy's breathing grew shallow, her hand cold in Arthur's grasp. She whispered his name, then sighed, as if slipping into a gentle dream. Her heart slowed. The light left her eyes. Arthur fell to his knees in despair, while Van Helsing placed a hand upon his shoulder. But the professor's expression was not one of finality. It was one of grim resolve, for he knew what the others did not yet suspect. Lucy's death was not the end. The Bloofer lady. A few nights after her burial, whispers began among the people of London. Children were vanishing, only to be found later, dazed, with strange marks upon their throats. They spoke of a beautiful lady in white, who beckoned them with a smile, leading them into the night. The papers called her the Bloofer lady, a child's corruption of beautiful. Dr. Seward, disturbed by the stories, confronted Van Helsing. The old professor met his gaze with steel. "She is not dead," he said. "At least, not as you think of death. She has become what we feared. Lucy is undead, a vampire." Seward recoiled, refusing to believe it, but Van Helsing pressed on. He demanded Seward, Arthur, and Quincy come with him to Lucy's tomb. By lamplight, they descended into the crypt. The air was cold, the stone walls damp. Van Helsing unlocked the coffin, and when they lifted the lid, they froze. Lucy's body lay not as they had buried her, pale and wasted, but full of color, her lips red, her beauty strangely heightened. She appeared not dead, but sleeping, her chest rising faintly as though with breath. Arthur cried out in anguish, but Van Helsing restrained him. "See with your eyes, and then believe," the professor said. The next night they returned, and this time they saw her with their own eyes. Lucy, in her burial gown, drifting through the graveyard with unnatural grace, a child clutched to her breast. When she saw them, her lips curled into a smile, her teeth glistening. She reached out to Arthur, calling his name sweetly, but Van Helsing thrust the crucifix before her. Lucy shrieked, her face twisting with fury, before fleeing back to her tomb. There, Van Helsing explained what must be done. Arthur, though broken with grief, agreed. With trembling hands, he drove a stake through Lucy's heart. Her scream pierced the night, then fell silent. Her body convulsed, then lay still. As Arthur withdrew, they saw her face restored to peace, her soul released. For Lucy Westenra, death had at last become true rest. Act 4. Mina's Peril, and the Hunt for Dracula. The death of Lucy Westenra cast a long shadow. Though her body lay at rest at last, her friends knew peace was far from won. Van Helsing, grave and resolute, reminded them that Lucy was but the first victim of a greater terror. Count Dracula still walked among them, and his ambitions stretched further than one life. It was Mina Harker, Jonathan's beloved wife, who soon became the Count's next target. At first, Mina was the group's strongest comfort. Her keen mind and gentle strength bound the men together when grief and rage threatened to pull them apart. She gathered Jonathan's journals, Dr. Seward's phonograph notes, and Van Helsing's meticulous writings, compiling them into a single record. This shared chronicle was both their shield and their weapon, allowing them to trace the vampire's movements with clarity. But as their understanding grew, so too did Dracula's awareness of them. The hunter had become the hunted. One evening, as storm clouds pressed against the windows of the asylum where they gathered, Mina grew pale. Jonathan, watching her closely, noticed her sudden weariness, as though life itself had drained from her face. Van Helsing pressed her hand and whispered a prayer under his breath, though he dared not voice his suspicion. That night, Jonathan awoke to a terrible sight. His wife's lips stained with blood, her expression dazed with horror. And standing over her, tall, gaunt, eyes blazing with unholy fire, was Count Dracula. Jonathan rushed forward, but the Count's strength was beyond mortal measure. With a sweep of his arm, he flung Jonathan aside as though he were a rag doll. Mina's cries filled the chamber, but Dracula's laughter, a hollow, chilling sound, drowned them out. "Your women are mine," he hissed. "Through them I shall control you all." Then with the speed of a shadow, he was gone, leaving only silence, terror, and Mina's faint sobs. The truth could no longer be denied. Mina had been marked. Dracula had forced her to drink of his blood, forging a dreadful bond. She now carried a trace of his will within her, a corruption that threatened to spread like a poison in her veins. Van Helsing, sorrow heavy in his voice, explained what this meant. Mina's life was in peril, and worse, her very soul stood at risk of becoming like Lucy's, trapped between life and death. Jonathan's anguish was almost unbearable, but Mina herself, pale yet unshaken, insisted they use her plight as a weapon. If Dracula had a link to her, then she had a link to him. Guided by prayer and courage, Mina allowed Van Helsing to place her under hypnosis. In that trance, her voice echoed with strange clarity. She described the lapping of waves, the creaking of timbers, the roar of the sea. The Count was fleeing England, bound for his homeland in Transylvania. Thus began the desperate pursuit. The group divided their forces, knowing that time was everything. Dracula's coffin had already been loaded aboard a ship, and if he reached the safety of his castle, their task would become nearly impossible. Jonathan and Arthur set out by train, racing across Europe. Seward and Van Helsing chose another route, cutting through rivers and mountain passes. Mina, though weakened, insisted on traveling with Van Helsing, her courage shining through her suffering. Each man felt the weight of their mission. The enemy they faced was no ordinary foe, but a being of centuries, cunning and merciless. Yet they carried with them the memory of Lucy and the love they bore Mina, as a shield stronger than steel. Through villages and across rugged landscapes they pressed on, gathering scraps of information, a cart seen rumbling by night, a strange box carried under guard, whispers of wolves in the forests. The Count's presence seemed to stain the land ahead of them, a darkness felt in the hearts of the people they met. At last, the chase neared its climax. The mountains of Transylvania rose in jagged peaks, crowned with snow, and the shadow of Castle Dracula loomed once more on the horizon. Act 5, the final confrontation. The travelers Jonathan, Mina, Van Helsing, Seward, Arthur, and Quincy arrive in the wild heart of Transylvania. The land is rugged, cruel, and wind-swept, as though nature itself bends toward Dracula's will. The journey's end. Their pursuit has been relentless. Dracula, desperate to reach his homeland, travels in a wooden box filled with the soil of his native earth, his last refuge. Through informants, bribery, and their own cleverness, the group has traced the Count's movements across the Danube, across plains and forests, until now the Carpathians rise before them. Mina, still marked by his curse, feels his nearness. At times she is lucid, helping to map the Count's path. At other times she shudders, sensing his thoughts pressing into hers. Her courage astounds them all. She insists she must go on, even knowing she may be the very bait Dracula seeks. Van Helsing and Mina in the mountains. As the group divides to cut off Dracula's routes, Van Helsing escorts Mina through the mountain passes. By nightfall, they reach the ruined chapel near Castle Dracula, where the professor sets holy wards to keep the undead at bay. And there, terrifying beyond words, Mina witnesses with her own eyes the brides of Dracula. Pale, hungry, and inhumanly beautiful, they call to her across the snow, whispering her name with voices like poisoned honey. But Van Helsing is resolute. With crucifix in hand and holy wafer pressed into the earth, he bars their advance. By morning, when sunlight scatters their shadows, he takes courage and drives stakes into their hearts, ending their unholy existence forever. Mina, though weak, praises his strength. One evil is ended, but the master remains. The hunters converge. Meanwhile, Jonathan, Arthur, Quincy, and Seward close in on the gypsy cart transporting Dracula's coffin. The sun begins to sink, bleeding its last light across the snow. They know that if darkness falls before they reach him, the Count will rise with all his terrible strength. With fierce urgency, they spur their horses forward, the sleigh runners cutting sharp paths through the ice. Ahead, the gypsies lash their beasts, shouting curses, fighting to protect the cargo they do not fully understand. The final battle. As the cart lurches toward the castle gates, Jonathan and Quincy leap to intercept. A brutal struggle erupts, blades flash, cries ring out in the bitter wind. Jonathan, driven by years of torment and vengeance, hacks furiously at the coffin's lid. At last, the lid splinters open. Inside, Count Dracula lies in deathly repose, eyes closed, lips curled in a mocking smile. Already, shadows lengthen. Soon he will awaken. But Quincy, wounded and bleeding, summons the last of his strength. With one final, desperate thrust, he drives his knife into Dracula's heart. At the same instant, Jonathan's blade slices through the Count's throat. Dracula's eyes fly open, flaring red one final time. His body convulses, then crumbles into dust. The evil that haunted them all is gone in an instant, leaving nothing but silence, the soft fall of snow, and the sound of Quincy gasping his last breaths. The aftermath. The gypsies, seeing their master destroyed, scatter into the wilderness. The storm breaks. The night seems less dark. But in the snow, Quincy Morris lies dying, pierced during the struggle. Surrounded by his friends, he smiles faintly, whispering that it was worth the price. With the last of his breath, he gazes toward Mina, now freed of the vampire's curse, and slips away. The group weeps, but they know his sacrifice has given the world peace. Epilogue. Years later, Jonathan and Mina Harker recount their tale. Their son, named after brave Quincy, grows strong and full of life, a living reminder of the courage and loyalty that defeated the darkness. And though shadows still linger in their dreams, the nightmare of Dracula has ended. Good has triumphed. Evil has been struck down in its lair. The story closes not with terror, but with a solemn truth. Even in the face of ancient darkness, the light of friendship, courage, and sacrifice can prevail.